Well, hello. I hope you can hear me and see me all right. And you're very, very welcome tonight. And this is the first of two talks around the theme of anxiety and stress and the way it can affect us and that kind of thing. And tonight we'll talk a little bit about anxiety and the way it can present and the way it can affect us, and make a couple of statements about some things we can do to help ourselves. And then next week, we'll talk a bit more about stress and its management. And also then we'll also talk a little bit more about treatment issues. So that's the way we're going to go over the next 2 weeks. And then next week will be the last one in this series. As you're aware, put your questions in the chat box, and then I'll deal with as many as I reasonably can in our question and answer session, which follows this first talk. As before, I talk more in this session on clinical issues, on a psychiatric perspective, and then in the last 15 minutes, I'll be talking more on the spiritual aspects of things. So a very, very big welcome to you. And as I say, next week, the next talk is next Wednesday, not 2 weeks' time. So remember, it's next Wednesday on the 9th of June, not in 2 weeks' time. Also, as before, if you would like to contribute to the Dalit network, the details are there on the advertisement. Please do so. We know that India is a very, very needy nation, particularly in these times. And also you'll find my YouTube site, which is Stephen Critchlow Mental Health. And many of these talks will be up there. Not all of them, because I didn't record all of them, but you'll find similar talks to the ones that were up there at the beginning. So you can also look at those, particularly one on COVID crisis. And then also there's a fuller one on depression. So those are the things we want to mention. Also, I just want to mention my book again, which is Mindful Delight, Practical Help and Spiritual Hope in Mental Health. And again, you can get that easily on Amazon. And so I'm hopeful that many of you will purchase that book and you'll find it a great help to you. So now I'm just going to begin to share some slides with you, and hopefully you'll be able to see them and catch up with what we're going to do. So here we go, while I just connect to my slides. So we're talking about anxiety and stress management. As I say, this is the first one of two, and I'll be talking more about anxiety today and how it affects us. And then next week, a little bit more about stress management and a bit more about treatment issues. And you can see my website up there. As before, I like to say that, you know, the information given is of a general nature. One or two of you asked me about whether I can get involved in individual situations. I'm sorry, I can't do that. It wouldn't really be ethical to do that. That really needs to go through your GP and your local situation. So I hope you understand that. And so none of the information given in this talk or raised in discussion should be construed as giving particular advice on individual problems. Obviously, you can ask me questions in the chat session, put them on the chat network there, and we'll deal with those, but you'll find that I won't be giving you necessary individual advice in those times. Of course, anxiety is a very, very common condition. All of us will at times feel anxious. It's, in a sense, part of being human is to be anxious, because when we face new situations, or you're facing an interview situation or a job situation, then you will probably feel a degree of anxiety. And that anxiety, as we often find, can be mitigated, can be helped by finding out as much about the job interview or the job situation as you possibly can. I would always like to find out as much about every situation that I would be going into if it's a completely new situation, because that the more you're informed and the more you know about the situation, then it really, really helps. But obviously there are many different definitions of anxiety, and here's just one. Anxiety is the feeling of fear that we get when faced with threatening or difficult situations. And I'm sure you can identify with that feeling of fear that we get when faced with threatening or difficult situations. The difficulty is that many, many people who might be very anxious, then the anxiety begins to affect their social or their occupational function. And in a sense, that's when it becomes what we might say clinically relevant or an issue. If that anxiety so affects you that you're not able to function socially, of course we have conditions like social phobia, where anxiety is very prominent, or you're not able to function in your job situation because of the levels of anxiety that you might be getting. And the younger people, you might say it becomes significant if school refusal is an issue, or somebody cannot manage with school because of their high anxiety levels. So all of us can get a bit anxious, but when it takes on the proportion of affecting our social or our occupational function, then it becomes significant. Of course, there are also many conditions that we recognize where anxiety is quite prominent. For example, we have conditions in psychiatry called post-traumatic stress disorder, when somebody's been facing a near-death situation and they may have large amounts of anxiety present, as well as other features. And I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'll mention on the way through conditions such as phobias, where there's specific fears about things, and also panic disorder I'll mention as well, as where again, anxiety is very prominent. Also, we might have anxiety as the main feature of an anxiety condition, or a generalized anxiety disorder, where someone's having high levels of anxiety every day, probably for 6 months or more, and it's grossly interfering with their occupational function and their social function. And obviously anxiety comes into other conditions as well. Sometimes people with depression can get very anxious as well as being depressed, and it can come in as a part and parcel of other mental health conditions, such as schizophrenia. Anxiety can be prominent there. And of course, drugs can make people anxious, particularly things like cocaine and amphetamines can have a high level of anxiety with them. And also coming off medication that the doctor might have prescribed, or coming off drugs of abuse. Again, anxiety can be a feature of that withdrawal. So anxiety is part and parcel of many, many conditions. I'm not going to go into detail on those conditions, that would take too much time, but I'm homing in a sense on the anxiety feature of some of those conditions. The second part of this slide, you'll notice that anxiety is associated with heavy alcohol use, smoking, and addiction problems, as well as sleep and depression disorders. Obviously, people can try and deal with anxiety by themselves. Of course, that is likely, if the anxiety is severe, can lead to abuse of alcohol. And so abuse of alcohol is a way of trying to deal with anxiety. Is not helpful. Trying to use alcohol as a way of dealing with any mental health condition is not helpful, because as you're aware, the problems with alcohol are that you can become dependent on the alcohol. The alcohol actually often acts as a depressant and can make people more depressed. It also causes a level of disinhibition. So we know, for example, that those who take a lot of alcohol often have that alcohol on board when they might threaten harm to themselves or even take their own lives. Alcohol is a part of that as well. So taking alcohol to deal with anxiety is not particularly helpful. Likewise, of course, smoking can be used as a way of dealing with anxiety, and obviously addiction problems can occur if people take other drugs as a way of dealing with anxiety. And sometimes people have become dependent on drugs called benzodiazepines, or in the past barbiturates, but more recently benzodiazepines. Actually, when you look at it carefully, benzodiazepines, things like Valium, Librium, they can be very, very useful drugs for severe anxiety, and not everyone will become dependent on them, and they're still very useful. They've had bad press, but sometimes they can be very helpful with very severe anxiety. Of course, we know that sleep and depression disorders can occur. Obviously, anxiety can affect your sleep, and you might need to look at things like sleep hygiene, we call it, to try and help you sleep. So we think of ways of helping your sleep, light exercise, avoiding too much caffeine, getting rid of all the lights and the paraphernalia of the internet and everything else a little while before you go to sleep, and trying to do something relaxing before you go to sleep. All those kinds of things can help you sleep. But of course, anxiety does cause sleep problems, and particularly difficulty in falling asleep. And anxiety can sometimes lead on to depression, although we tend to keep them separate. And I've talked already in this series about depression on a couple of occasions. There's a lower rate found in married people. In other words, being married tends to help your anxiety levels, and it's twice as common in women as in men. So that's just a little bit of general stuff about anxiety. And now I want to talk a little bit more about how fear and anxiety can more affect our minds. Obviously, when you're very anxious, you can tend to be what we call hyper alert or apprehensive. In other words, there's a sense of feeling on edge. And obviously anxiety causes that feeling of being hyper alert. That is particularly common in the anxiety of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, as well as other forms of anxiety. You're aware in your mind of feeling worried and anxious, and obviously we can also get panic attacks, which I'll come on to. The general feeling with anxiety is a feeling of difficulty, often with facing situations. And, that is very, very common. You feel, if you're very anxious, you can't face a particular situation. Now, generally speaking, if you can face the situation and go through it, then you kind of break the anxiety barrier. For example, learning to drive. I might have mentioned this before, but learning to drive can be quite stressful because, it depends on who's teaching you to drive, of course. I remember learning to drive my father on one occasion, but actually that didn't work out too well because we got into a situation of where I just suddenly had enough, stopped the car and wouldn't go any further. And that wasn't very helpful in that situation. Also, teaching my daughter to drive, I had a similar situation where she turned into the wrong side of the street. And again, I suffered major anxiety in that situation. So difficulty in facing situations, like difficulty in learning to drive, can be an anxiety-provoking situation, but you tend to go through that anxiety barrier because you actually believe that learning to drive is a very important skill. And so you master the anxiety, you face the situation, and you go through that anxiety barrier. And generally speaking, facing anxiety and going through it is a very useful skill to develop. And as you do that, then you find that the anxiety usually will lessen. Of course, there are situations, as you might imagine, where facing the situation is not the best thing. For example, if you're walking near the top of a cliff, then actually it doesn't help to face the anxiety. It's best to withdraw from the edge and be sensible. I'm sure you understand that. Obviously, particular phobias are associated with anxiety, and I'll mention that. And obviously, when anxiety affects your level of concentration, and again, that can be a real problem to you. And sometimes people say they can't concentrate, and it's because of the high levels of anxiety that they're going through. Poor memory can occur, and part of my psychiatric experience has been at times running memory clinics for people who are very worried about their poor memory. And obviously, I will have people come into that clinic who might have a condition called dementia, and sometimes relatives will bring them in and tell me their memory is poor, even though the person themselves might deny it, and then I will test them out and find their memory is indeed poor. But on the other hand, I've also had some high-flying executive types in their late 50s coming along to the memory clinic because of their concerns that their memory is very poor. And usually I found with those people that when I do the relevant tests, that they're all fine, there's no particular problem. And on the memory tests I do in clinic, or maybe some basic investigations, all things are basically fine. But essentially what has happened is they're highly stressed and they're not concentrating very well, and their lack of concentration has caused their memory to be affected, so their memory is not so good because they're basically not taking in information, and because they're not taking it in, they're not really able to retain it, and that is because they're highly aroused and not concentrating well. And usually, of course, I'm able to reassure those people and send them on their way. Of course, if anxiety is severe, tearfulness may happen, and feelings of exhaustion will often be there because people don't understand that actually the high levels of anxiety that they're going through are creating a kind of outpouring of adrenaline and similar things, and that is leading the body to a sense of exhaustion and depression. And obviously, those high levels of adrenaline and also cortisol as well, they can also affect you physically in some ways as well. And if there are high levels going on, they can affect you, your immune system, and also your cardiovascular system. So you want to try and win and not be exhausted and depressed all the time because of your very high anxiety levels, producing all that output of adrenaline and things in the body. You may also find that irritability or quickness to anger can be there, and also feeling unreal. And we talk about depersonalization or derealization. Derealization is the sense of feeling that the environment around you has somehow changed, and in a sense it's become unreal. That's happened to me once when I was facing my medical finals, and I remember being in a pathology lecture, and also I was highly aroused studying for my exams, and also I had some personal problems at that time, which I won't go into detail on, but I suddenly felt in the middle of that pathology lecture, it was also probably a bit hot and a bit stuffy in the room, I suddenly felt somehow everything around me had somehow become unreal. And that's the only time I've experienced that, but that derealization was there. Alternatively, people feel depersonalization. They feel so highly aroused that somehow they have changed in a certain way, and they sense that they themselves are different, and that's depersonalization. So that's some ways that fear and anxiety can affect our minds. How can it affect our bodies? Well, in a sense, almost every system can be affected by anxiety. And what I would say here, of course, is this, that I'm going to go through a list of things that ways that anxiety can affect our bodies. But of course, there are other things that can produce similar effects. So for example, if some of these things were to become a real problem to you, then it would be no harm to get to see your doctor to get reassured that it is actually anxiety you're facing. For example, sometimes hormonal abnormalities such as thyroid abnormalities and other things can sometimes cause some of these things. And you may just want to, if they're severe, get yourself checked out. But obviously headaches, we know, are related to anxiety. And I know sometimes in situations where I'm struggling a little bit myself, as we all struggle at times, yes, headaches might be there. You might also get a bit of a dry mouth, as I have now, and so I'm going to take a sip of water. A dry mouth can be related to anxiety. Sleep disturbance, I've mentioned. Shortness of breath and hyperventilation. I'll come on to that a little bit more when I talk about panic disorder in a minute or two, but feeling short of breath is quite common. And actually what tends to happen is then people overbreathe, which is the hyperventilation. Because they feel a bit short of breath, they overbreathe. And I'll come on to that, how that affects our bodies. Sensitivity to noise. I sometimes tell people I can tell how anxious they are. I'll just come behind them and drop a heavy metal object and make a noise behind them and see how high they jump. That sensitivity to noise is there. Palpitations, which is awareness of your heartbeat. That can be a problem to people. Tiredness and weariness, I've mentioned. Pains or tightness in the chest or jaw, again, can be a little bit of a problem. I remember my wife telling me this story, and it's an interesting story of a man who came into the accident and emergency department on one occasion, and he ran into the hospital, into the accident and emergency department. And I'm not sure you'll be able to see me doing this, but he was doing this to himself. Now, you might recognize that there's a particular stage where you do that movement on the chest, pushing in on the chest. And of course, you do that when you're trying to resuscitate somebody. In other words, all doctors have these courses in resuscitation. So if somebody collapses on the floor, they can check them out and then may need to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation. You push on the chest, obviously, to get somebody round, and it's a very useful skill, not only for doctors, but for others to have as well. But anyway, he was doing this on the way into the casualty department, the accident emergency department. And one of the doctors said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that to yourself? Why are you pushing on your own chest?" Well, he says, I've had some pain in my chest, doctor. So I assumed I was having a heart attack. And I knew that if I was having a heart attack, then I would probably collapse and I would need resuscitation. So I thought I'd start the process myself first. Of course, that wasn't terribly sensible. What, of course, he'd had was that he had a panic attack. And as he was having that panic attack, he was getting severe chest pain related to the panic attack. And then he needed just to relax a little. Of course, that's what I say, pain in the chest could be a panic attack. Of course, it could be something more serious, which is why sometimes you might need advice for some of these things. Feeling a lump in the stomach, or obviously, more frankly, indigestion, nausea, diarrhea, and we talk about that as a problem as well. You might have an irritable bowel syndrome as a result of anxiety. Of course, there are other causes of having difficulty with your bowel, but anxiety can be one of those. Giddiness or dizziness or unsteadiness, or frank fainting can occur. I remember fainting once, having been in a dentist's chair. I hate going to the dentist, and I fell down some stairs at that occasion. I don't think the dentist ever knew about it, but actually I picked myself up and I was fine. So I did actually faint, having had that experience. That hasn't happened to me for many, many years, but it can occur. we overbreathe, we feel giddy, we feel dizzy, we feel unsteady, we might even faint. Sweating, pins and needles, cold, clammy hands, difficulty swallowing, nausea and diarrhea I've mentioned, increased frequency of passing urine or micturition, that can occur, and ringing the ears of tinnitus. So all of those things are physical things that can happen to us as a result of severe anxiety. And as I've also mentioned, they can occur in other physical conditions. So you might need medical advice on occasion. Of course, we also know that anxiety can cause interpersonal effects because we go through, we're all involved in relationships, and sometimes anxiety can cause you to withdraw from your family and friends, and that withdrawal may not be understood by others, and also may cause some diminution or some limiting of your relationships because you tend to withdraw. Other people might respond to anxiety by becoming very irritable, and that irritability can be a problem and can lead to taking it out on others, lashing out, angry outbursts, or even physical violence. Of course, that way also would have a deleterious effect on your relationships. I mentioned going through the effects of overbreathing, and I'm not going to do this tonight because I'm online and I can't see you, but sometimes with a live audience I've done this, and what I will tell people to do is to breathe in and out as fast as they can over the next half minute or so. I haven't had anybody collapse on me yet. There's always going to be a first time, but basically I then ask people what their experience is as a result of that. And essentially what they often say is, I felt tremulous or faint or dizzy. And with anxiety, that can be a vicious circle, because you see somebody with anxiety may feel that they're not getting enough air into their lungs, and so they'll overbreathe and they'll overbreathe. And what happens with that overbreathing in the body is this, that the level of oxygen in the bloodstream stays pretty well constant, but something else in the bloodstream, carbon dioxide, the level of that will actually go down when you overbreathe. And when you overbreathe, what actually tends to happen is the little arteries called the arterioles in the brain, they respond to low levels of carbon dioxide thinner. And of course, if that continues, then the blood supply will be briefly cut off from the brain, and somebody will then faint. Of course, when they faint, they briefly stop breathing. The carbon dioxide corrects itself to normal levels, and they wake up and say, what happened? And it's because they were overbreathing to that extent. And of course, that understanding the chemistry of that overbreathing is a way of helping us with breathing exercises, which I'll come on to in just a moment or two. But as you can see, that overbreathing can become a vicious circle and make anxiety and make you feel more anxious, and then overbreathe more. It can be a vicious circle. And so the overbreathing is connected to anxious feelings, feeling on edge, and then you tend to overbreathe, and you might obviously faint. And that, of course, can show itself in panic attacks. And just mentioning panic attacks, common feeling will be feelings of shortness of breath, of feelings of smothering or choking, often palpitations and awareness of the heartbeat, chest pain or discomfort, 43%, we've mentioned that, sweating, dizziness, unsteady feelings or faintness. Sometimes those feelings are unreality, we've mentioned, we feel unreal ourselves, or around us unreal, that's the depersonalization, the derealization, the numbness, the tingling, the flushes or chills, the trembling or shaking. And what is quite common is people feel so awful that they feel they're going to die, or they feel they're going to go crazy or doing something uncontrolled. And obviously, if you had a panic attack, say in a supermarket, and you came over in this way, you felt all these things coming over you, you felt this great fear in you of dying or going crazy or something, then you might say, I'm never going to go back to that supermarket. I'm never going to go back to face that situation again. And of course, if you do that, then you get into a pattern of avoidance. And so panic attacks are often related to a condition called agoraphobia, which essentially is really a fear of going outside. And you find that people can sometimes be in their own home for years on end. I've met people years on end in their own home, afraid of going out, afraid of the panic attacks. And then the agoraphobia kicks in and they get the sense of not wanting to go out anymore. And their lives are radically changed by their difficulty facing the panic attacks. Of course, the way to deal with that often is to begin to face the situations, but you might need help to do that and the help of the therapist. And you may need to take a few steps at a time to go forward in that situation. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about treatment issues, even on some of these things next week. But I wanted just to share with you, again, something I often do in my lectures, my public lectures on these areas. I sometimes ask people to basically say, to try some of these breathing techniques, because if you can try them and master them and use them appropriately, they can be very, very useful. And so having asked people to breathe in and out as fast as they can over half a minute, I will then sometimes say, now what I want you to do is do what I put up here. I want you to breathe in only through your nose and breathe in out only through your mouth. And as you're breathing, use your abdomen, your stomach as much as possible, and use your chest wall as little as possible, and breathe into the count of 4. So I'll count them in 1, 2, 3, 4 as you breathe in, and then breathe out to the count of 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and really slow your breathing down. And then I'll ask them after half a minute or so of doing that, how they feel. And they'll say, Doctor, I'm feeling relaxed, I'm feeling calm. And other people will say, I'm feeling sleepy. And I will say to them, well, don't fall asleep just yet, because I'm still talking, but you can sleep afterwards. But learning to control your breathing like that can be very, very valuable. So for example, if you're prone to a panic attack in a supermarket, if you're somehow able to slow yourself down, maybe take a seat before you go in and do some breathing exercises over a minute or two, then you can calm yourself down and then face the situation. And many people facing very difficult situations find that these breathing techniques can be very, very valuable. Of course, there are similar techniques that we can use in terms of muscular relaxation as well. And the way to do that is, in a sense, tense a muscle, hold the tension, and then release it. You can start that with your feet and then do that progressively through the muscles in your body. And that method of muscular relaxation can be very, very valuable. Of course, also learning simple ways to relax, know what you can do to relax. Walking and exercise are very, very valuable. All kinds of mental health disorders can be helped by simple exercise programs. I was talking online to someone in Spain not long ago, about 2 or 3 months ago, and he said, well, I can't go outside. How can I exercise? Well, yeah, I mean, you can develop an exercise program to use simply indoors. And I quite often use a simple 5-minute exercise program, particularly if I know I'm going to find that day it difficult to get out to do some walking or possibly some jogging. I'll do a 5-minute indoor exercise program. So learning to use exercise, that can be very helpful. Of course, other ways to relax, having friends, music, gardening, hot bath, massage. Pets can be very relaxing. Sometimes, a person with a pet dog or something can be very, very relaxing and helping the person. Also, with older people, sometimes having a dog or something can help them in their relationships with neighbors, because people always stop and pat your dog, etc. Nature, books, comedy, and sometimes just having a set time to relax. I know that at times in my past when I've been extremely busy, I've purposely put in 1 hour when I will do something relaxing. Otherwise, you tend to drive yourself all the time, and that's not helpful. Try and do something you enjoy every day. Keep in touch with others. Keep a sense of humor. And as I've said, strengthening your physical health basically helps you to deal with stress, and obviously getting enough sleep. And I haven't mentioned it in detail here, but if you want to go on the web and look up something like sleep hygiene, they'll give you some principles of how to get some good sleep. So in just finishing this first part, I'm just going to talk about briefly some further resources. Beating the Blues, Mood Gym, Fear Fighter, Calypso. Living Life to the Full is a very, very good website run by Professor Chris Williams, who's a consultant psychiatrist, and Living Life to the Full. He also has another one up there, which I've not put up there, but it's called www.livinglifetothefullwithgod.com, livinglifetothefullwithgod.com, and you can go onto that, and we could mention that maybe later. But also in many of these areas, getting support from a therapist can be very, very valuable in tackling more severe forms of anxiety. And also on the college website, the Royal College of Psychiatrists website, and other websites, you can download very useful booklets on anxiety and panic and cognitive behavior therapy, which we might talk about next week. All of those booklets can be very helpful to download and look at in terms of looking at anxiety problems. Well, that's about as much as I have time for in this session. Obviously, there are lots more things I'm going to say next time on stress and also more on treatment issues. But now I'm going to try and find the chat and see what questions you've got for me this week in the chat. And I hope I'll be able to address some of these questions. So let's see what I've got in the chat session. And also, I see I've got 2 down there to answer. So if there's any more questions you've got for me, put them in the chat session, and I'll try and deal with them if I can over the next 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you. So the question is there something one can do for adrenal fatigue from constant anxiety or frequent trauma? Thank you. Well, the adrenal gland is the mentioned there is the source of adrenaline and other hormones, and the adrenaline is often related to high levels of anxiety and high levels of panic, and the adrenal gland is pushing out the adrenaline, and also there's often a release of high levels of cortisol. And of course, high levels of adrenaline, high levels of cortisol all the time do have a negative impact on the body. They certainly interfere with immune function and make your immune system not working so well. For example, we often use cortisol medically as a way of dampening down the immune system if somebody's immune system is in what we call autoimmune conditions, where the immune system is over-functioning and functioning against our own bodily systems. We use cortisol and other things in those situations, steroids. So we know that that works, but the problem is that the adrenaline and the cortisol do interfere with the immune system, and they also may have cardiovascular effects as well, and they cause this intense fatigue and this intense tiredness. So that is what the adrenal gland and the other cortisol is doing to us. And essentially, the way to deal with that is to obviously find ways of overcoming and dealing with our anxiety, which is driving it. That's the way around. So we need to find ways of dealing with the anxiety and the high anxiety levels. And as I've said, I've begun to talk about that today and mentioned breathing exercises and mentioned relaxation. And obviously there are a number of other ways. I'm going to talk about dealing with that next week. For example, I intend to say more about cognitive behavior therapy. I intend to say more about how a therapist being involved with us can be very helpful. I intend to say more about medication issues next week. So I'm not going to go into that in detail this week because I can't really go into it in detail just right now. But come next week, I'll talk more about some of those ways of dealing with anxiety, because obviously you've got to cut the anxiety down and the level of fear, anxiety, etc. Down to be able, and the stress levels down to be able to, in a sense, be able to deal with coping with bringing the hormonal output down, which has those other effects as I've mentioned. The second question is, will today's talk be available on your YouTube channel? The answer to that is yes. I thought about it a lot initially. I wasn't going to record the initial sessions because I wanted involvement online, but the more I've gone on with this, I've changed my mind a little bit and have decided to record them. And so this recording will be put up on my YouTube site in the next little while. So just look out for it there. The YouTube site is Stephen Critchlow Mental Health, those 4 separate words, and you'll find it up there. And you'll also find, there's also up there talks on depression and anxiety. So although the 2 talks on depression in this series weren't actually recorded, you'll find a longer session on depression there if you look hard enough. It's one of the early ones, and that will also deals with depression, and you'll also find some talks on other subjects as well. What would you suggest for someone who generally lives their life from one trauma to the next one? Yeah, wow, what a question. You know, sometimes people do get into the habit of living from one crisis to the next. And sometimes it's the crisis and the trauma that actually drive the adrenaline. And sometimes the adrenaline rush can be quite enjoyable for a while. But the problem is if you go from crisis to crisis, then that actually is going to, in a sense, have a deleterious effect on your body systems because of the high levels of hormones that you're putting out, which will also create fatigue. Well, obviously, you know, there comes a time where you need to think about planning and managing your life. And next week, I'll also talk a little bit about time management and learning certain skills of relaxation and time management, and learning to, in a sense, plan your life rather than live from crisis to crisis is going to be very useful. So learning to plan our lives, and also some of the spiritual things I'll talk about can be ways of helping people to manage those crises, to in a sense, deal with them. And I think often what tends to happen in people who are very anxious or very much on the go is they don't stop long enough to think about their lives, to plan their lives, because obviously if you think about things and you can plan things, then you can plan out of your life a lot of the crises, a lot of the ups and downs. You can plan a lot of them out of it if you think about your life carefully. You can't plan all of them, of course, because sometimes things happen out of the blue that you're not suspecting. But the more we can plan our lives, the more we can, in a sense, take charge of our lives, then the better we are for that. So that's living lives from trauma to trauma. Okay, obviously, I'm going to leave those 3 questions there. And if there's anybody else online at present, I haven't seen who's online at present, if there's anybody else online and you've experienced in helping people with anxiety, either as a counselor or a doctor or someone involved in counseling or helping. If you want to say anything, if you want to dive in and say anything on any of those three questions we put up there, now is your opportunity to add something to what I've said, because obviously what I've said on these areas isn't by any means complete. And so I'd invite anybody else, if you have experience of dealing with anxiety or stress in some form, if you want to add into those questions, here's your opportunity. So I assume there's nobody either brave enough or nobody skilled enough from your background to want to add into those questions. Is there anybody? And is there any last question from anybody? Because we do have a little time. Okay, right. Well, I'm going to go on then to one or two spiritual aspects of anxiety, and again, those are the resources up there if you need those, to have a look at those more carefully. Of course, the Psalms, and particularly the Psalms of David, are so true to his experience, and you find that one of the things that King David does is he pours out his heart before God, whatever struggles he's going through. And some obviously are full of his struggles, and others are psalms that are more full of his sense of having discovered God's help again, you know. And so here we want to just look at this beautiful psalm. And obviously it's one of my favorites. And although I'm not very good at memorizing scripture, this would be one that I've memorized from a young age, because I do believe it's obviously very well known and has become the source of some lovely hymns as well. But it is a beautiful psalm that expresses so much of our relationship with God and the relationship that we want to have with him. And it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, and he restores my soul." And that's the way that this psalm starts. And of course, the beauty is that we have the Lord who wants to be in close and intimate relationship with each one of us. And so it says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And of course, the idea of the shepherd in the Bible is the shepherd is in front. The shepherd is leading the sheep forward. The shepherd is the one who goes before. And, you know, and obviously the shepherd is the one who will guide the sheep and lead the sheep. And so the relationship that God envisages for us is the relationship whereby he is the one who will lead us, and he is the one who will guide us, and I will not want. Now, we might say, well, surely we can't go through life without wanting and without being needy. And the answer is, no, we can't. There will always be wants and there will always be needs. But the sense is that the Lord is the one who will actually help us and lead us. Just from my own experience, in 1990, I left where I was living in London at that stage and went to live in Cyprus. And I took with me, obviously, my wife and my 5 young daughters at that stage. And I left my medical work for a period of time, for a couple of years, and I devoted myself to leading the church that I was asked to lead in Limassol. in Cyprus, but it was not a paid position. And so after about 18 months or so, I ran out of money pretty well completely, and all I had left was a few coins in my pocket. And obviously I felt responsible for my wife and my 5 young daughters, and I did not know what to do. But I remember one day I went to the local Greek supermarket, and it was just before the Greek Easter. And at that time, the Greeks tend to stop eating meat, and they eat largely vegetables in that period leading up to Easter. And I went to the shop, and I thought I would like to buy some cauliflowers because I had some cheese in the fridge at home. It was about the only thing I had left. But I thought I'll add the cauliflowers to the cheese and we can make a meal for my family. And after that, I don't know what I'm going to do, because I didn't want to ask people for money. I didn't feel that was necessarily right, because I'd said that the Lord is the one looking after me. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And so I went to the supermarket and I looked at the shelves and looked at the cauliflowers and found that I did not have enough money for them. And I remember in the shop, I prayed, and I prayed to God and said, God, you know, I believe that you're with me. I believe that you're my Lord, you're my Father, and I believe that you are looking after me. But I really would love some cauliflowers. And I left the shop and went home. And I opened my front door, and then I opened my kitchen door. And I couldn't believe what I saw. In front of me were 3 great big cauliflowers, plus a lot of other vegetables. And I said to my wife, what happened? I've just been in the shop and I've been praying for cauliflowers because I didn't have enough money. And here are these beautiful cauliflowers plus all these other vegetables. Where have they come from? And she said to me this, she said, well, you know, a couple of nights ago, I did some babysitting for someone in the church, and he has a market garden. And just this morning, he felt from God that he should bring round all these vegetables to ourselves. I said, well, that is remarkable and that is beautiful, because God has so clearly answered my request. And after that, great big bags of food arrived on our doorstep. We didn't know where they were from. It only happened for 2 or 3 weeks. And then the crisis passed, and I've never been in that situation again. Now I'm in a situation where I have plenty by God's grace. But you see, the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. And we can all have that relationship with God, whereby we can know he is our shepherd. I know for certain that if I was in that situation again, God would provide. You see, he is my shepherd, I shall not want. Does that mean I don't have to go through different kinds of crises, different kinds of difficulties? Does it mean I don't go through periods of anxiety at times? Of course not, those things happen. But I've found that I can bring all those anxieties and all those pressures back to the Lord who's my shepherd. And you see, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. And I found that time and time again, that when I go through periods where I'm very anxious or life is very difficult, I've learned the lesson to spend time alone with God and pour out all those problems on him. And I found after a while that I feel a sense of peace and a sense of him being with me. Not all the time, but very often I do feel that he is actually restoring my soul. You see, the relationship we have with the Lord is so very, very fundamental to our lives. And you know, if we have that sense of relationship with God, then we will know that he will help us as we go through anxiety and pressure and difficulty, that he is going to be there helping us and being with us in what we go through. You see, he is the one who restores my soul. The psalm also goes on to say that, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for he is with me. His rod and staff, they comfort me. Of course, in this COVID crisis, we've had that, haven't we? So many people going through bereavement, as we talked about last time. So many people going through bereavement on their own because they can't even say goodbye to the one that is leaving them through death. And that is so, so difficult for them. But it does say, that even when we go through the valley of the shadow of death, he will be with us. He will not leave us in those situations. Of course, that's not to say we don't need the help of others and support of others too. Of course, there are situations where we need to phone a friend and talk to somebody and let them know. I mean, I know in this COVID crisis, there have been days where I thought, I need to ring somebody up. I need to have a good chat with a friend. That is necessary at times. Of course it is. And he's put us together for good reasons. And no man is an island. And we need to sometimes talk to the friend and find help through them as well. That's true. And that's valuable. But of primary importance is having this relationship with the Lord that can be so deep and meaningful in our lives. So that psalm about the Lord being our good shepherd, and of course you can read the whole psalm. I haven't put the whole psalm up there, but it's very important. And of course, in the New Testament, it also talks about the Lord being the good shepherd. The good shepherd. The Lord himself takes the idea of the shepherd from the Old Testament, lifts it into the New, and then says, I am the good shepherd. And Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And of course, in the cross situations, Jesus goes forward to the cross. You see him in the Garden of Gethsemane pouring out his heart to God. And there he's going through, in a sense, a very troubled experience. He's going through the trouble and the pain. He doesn't want to go to the cross because physically it would be so difficult and spiritually so demanding. He would prefer to avoid it. But remember, in that garden, as he pours out his heart to God the Father, he says, Father, let this cup pass from me, because he'd prefer not to face it. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And you can see there, in a sense, very, very troubled, very, very difficult. But then in the end, as he pours out his heart to God the Father, he finds strength and he finds peace. And you look at Christ, as it were, as he moves from the garden forward to the cross, and you see him walking in perfect calm and in perfect peace, no matter what Judas could do, no matter what the Romans did to him, no matter what the Jews did to him, all the suffering he bore on the way up to the cross, he walks through it calmly, because he's found that calm through that garden experience where he's poured out his soul before the Father, and he's found through that pouring out of his soul the peace and the tranquility to move forward into all that suffering. And there's no doubt that Jesus goes to that cross voluntarily. He knows it's coming. You look at what he says, he's known it coming for a long time. He knows it's coming and he walks to it calmly. Why does he do that? Of course, he's doing it because he says the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That sacrifice, of course, was essential. There was no other way to deal with the sin of the world. Of course, on his shoulders on that cross, Jesus is bearing our sin and he's bearing our shame. It's saying that he, the just one, bore the sins of us, the unjust ones, to bring us to God. He is taking on his shoulders all of our sin and all of our shame, so that we might know his forgiveness. And you can see that forgiveness flowing from the cross as he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, forgiving even those who are tormenting him and persecuting him. And in the very same way, of course, as we look to that cross, we see there is peace for me, and there is forgiveness, because my sins are taken away through what Christ has done on that cross for me. And of course, the cross isn't the end, because the resurrection comes 3 days later, and the clear evidence that Christ is alive as he walks with his disciples, as he talks with them, as he eats with them, and 500 see him at the very same time. And then, of course, the testimony of those apostles who lay down their lives almost to a man in martyrdom, saying, we know, we ate with him, we talked with him. This wasn't a figment of our imaginations. It wasn't some Christ who somehow struggled half dead from the tomb. No, we knew he was gloriously alive. You see, people will die for what they believe in sometimes, but people won't die for what they know is false. Think about that. They knew it was true. They knew they'd been with him, and they laid down their lives for it. So the resurrection confirms all that Christ has done. And of course, Jesus says, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth. And his presence is with us. We may not always feel that presence. We feel it sometimes more than we do as others. But there's no doubt in the reality of the glory of that presence in our own lives. And so Jesus dies for us. He's alive, he's risen from the dead, and he wants to be with us always. And he wants to be that good shepherd who will lead and guide our lives. And of course, we need to be ready for that and say, Lord, I understand fully that you want to be my shepherd. I understand fully you want to guide me and lead me. And I'm ready for that. I'm up for that. I'm ready to give my life to you so that you would lead me and you would guide me and you would always be with me. And so finally here, as I do end these sessions, I have a prayer for you. And the prayer is not complicated, but it says this: Lord Jesus, thank you that you laid down your life on the cross for me. Thank you that from that cross flows forgiveness and new life. Lord, I turn away from living for myself to live for you and to follow you. You are the good shepherd, and I invite you to come into my life to be with me and help me each day. You see, life is a relationship with Jesus. He wants to be with us always. And of course, that choice is ours. Nobody forces anything on anybody. But Jesus lovingly invites us to, in a sense, lay down our lives and to follow him. Because in following him, there is forgiveness and there is joy and there is freedom. So let's pray this together. Pray it with me if you will. Lord Jesus, thank you that you laid down your life on the cross for me. Thank you that from that cross flows forgiveness and new life. Lord, I turn away from living for myself to live for you and to follow you. You are the good shepherd, and I invite you to come into my life, to be with me and help me each day. Amen. And again, I would say to you, as if you've prayed that prayer and it's really been meaningful to you, please let me know. Please drop me an email. I haven't had any emails yet following these prayers. It would really encourage me if anybody wanted to write and say, actually, that was helpful to me. That prayer was helpful. And also if you've got any comments on the talk so far, drop them to me either in an email or in the box. I haven't seen all the comments, but I'll try and catch up with them. And thank you so much for being part of this tonight. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. And I pray that God will really, really bless you. Just take a look at the gallery view here, because I know that I don't usually do that, but it's lovely to see your faces up there. And thank you very much for